But let's bring in Suzanne Chad, who is a professor of political science at North Central College. She is joining us now via Zoom. Suzanne, were you surprised by this announcement today?
Well, even though, as you both said, we thought that this was coming, it still somehow hits a bit as a shock because this hasn't happened before. And because, to the points that were made earlier, the Biden campaign was saying that, oh no, he's still in the race and he's going to be doing this and going to this event, which makes perfect sense that they would, keep the tagline going until all the pieces were in place to announce. But I think what's going to be very interesting as we move forward is to hear from President Biden himself on what was it that finally made him make this decision. We know that it had taken a couple of days and he was drafting the statement. And even though politically maybe this was the right move, I think the point that, Paul, that I think that you made about giving President Biden his moment and his time and for people to talk about the service and the choice he made is very important here.
And, Suzanne, I'm asking you this not as a legal question, really as a political question. But one of the things that we can expect coming up right now is that Republicans will make a whole series of motions to challenge this. It'll be a legal set of motions to say that, Kamala Harris can't be on the ballot, all that kind of thing. Politically speaking, is that a wise thing for Republicans to do? Or should they simply step back and realize the Democrats need a candidate and a nominee, and that's going to be Vice President Harris, and simply move forward with that?
Right. Yeah, I think it's important to note, as you said, and I'll just say it again here, there's nothing illegal or undemocratic about a process that will now unfold for the Democratic nominee and then putting that nominee on the ballots in November. The question, again, as you raise, is what is smart on the part of the Republican Party? I think what they will do here, what Trump will do and his allies and outside ads will probably do if Kamala Harris is the nominee or actually whomever is the nominee, is rather than legal challenges, I think the smart thing is to say, see, this is what we've told you. Nothing that this party does is democratic. They say they care about voters. They actually don't care about the will of the voters. It's sort of forwarding this tagline of rigged elections and not caring about the legitimacy of institutions. Legal challenges won't get you anywhere because there's nothing legal about DNC rules in terms of constitutions and laws. It's within their own party and in their own institution. But I think we're going to hear a lot of the taglines we already hear about elections. This just adds to that. I think they'll run with that.
To your point, Suzanne, former President Trump put out a lengthy statement, said a lot of things, was bashing Joe Biden, but also said, you're taking away his votes. He got all the votes in the primary. And so this is very undemocratic. So very much to your point. I want to get to a statement by former President Barack Obama, now an elder statesman in the party. Paul remembers when George W. Bush exited the spotlight after he was done with his 2 terms. He said, I'm not going to be part of the Klieg-lights. It's going to go away. I have a different role to play. Former presidents, they try not to tip the scales. When there's a primary contest, you want to let the party sort things out. So let's look at this statement here. He said in part, Joe Biden has been one of America's most consequential presidents, as well as a dear friend and partner to me. Today, we've also been reminded again that he's a patriot of the highest order. He goes on to say, we will be navigating uncharted waters in the days ahead, but I have extraordinary confidence that the leaders of our party will be able to create a process from which an outstanding nominee emerges. I believe that Joe Biden's vision of a generous, prosperous, and united America that provides opportunity for everyone will be on full display at the Democratic Convention in August. That raises a lot of questions. Will the Democrats pick their nominee at the convention? I mean, there's a ballot access issue in Ohio, and obviously former President Obama would understand better than anyone that when you vote for the president, you're also voting for the vice president. They campaigned together in the primary. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I think what former President Obama said and the way that he said it, and then we saw the statement from Vice President Harris where she said, I'm going to earn and win this nomination. I think that that's what President Obama is trying to do, is say, let's honor President Biden for his service. And then now let the Democratic Party engage in the process of nominating. And so typically what happens, and I think what probably will still happen, is they'll do the virtual roll call at the beginning of August to get a sense of where the state delegates are. And at that point, we'll know whether or not they'll be casting their votes for Vice President Harris or for others. We don't want it to go, we as a nation don't want it to go to a second round where super delegates have to get involved. That looks very messy. But I think it's important that there's a recognition that a process will play out as opposed to an anointing of a nominee, because that does look undemocratic.
You know, Suzanne, I want to get your take on this. There's a lot of people who said, you know, the last 2 weeks we've been seeing this congressman on board, that senator on board, calling for the president to step down from the election. But for me, once Speaker Emeritus Nancy Pelosi got involved, who's often seen as the general of the party, once she decided this is what was going to happen, there was no turning back. And interestingly, in many ways, all she ever said publicly was, well, the president needs to make a decision. I've heard some comparisons to like The Godfather. There's no fingerprints on it, but you know who's behind this decision. Well, she, of course, has been issued a statement on this as well. I want to read it to you and get your statement on that. Former Speaker Pelosi says, President Joe Biden is a patriotic American who has always put our country first. His legacy of vision, values, and leadership make him one of the most consequential presidents in American history. With love and gratitude to President Biden for always believing in the promise of America and giving people the opportunity to reach their fulfillment. God blessed America with Joe Biden's greatness and goodness. Sounds like Nancy Pelosi is saying it all happened naturally, but her fingerprints are there, right?
Yeah, and the report suggests that that's really where President Biden, where most of his sort of frustration and indignation really came from, was when he thought that that Nancy Pelosi was going behind his back to try to pull some strings to get him to step down. And he was very frustrated and upset by that. And so I think that, to your point, I think that Nancy Pelosi was very quietly having conversations. But I don't think, as I don't think any of us would suggest, that she's the sole reason he decided to step down. But the statement that she makes, a lot like President Obama's statement, is to honor the legacy of President Biden and not get involved and wade in the political process as we see who the nominee might be moving forward.
Suzanne, are you comfortable with us doing a little Veep stakes here? We've got a statement from Governor J.B. Pritzker, himself long rumored to have presidential ambitions. He put out a statement this afternoon. He's saying, in part, Joe Biden has dedicated his life in service to this nation, and its citizens are all better for it. His is a storied political career culminating in one of the most accomplished and effective presidencies of our lifetime, and we extend our gratitude to President Biden and reflect on his many accomplishments. We must not ignore the threat posed by Donald Trump's potential return to the White House. I will work every day to ensure that he does not win in November. Notable there was no endorsement of Kamala Harris. We want to put up on a list of all the potential vice presidential candidates for Kamala Harris, if in fact she is the Democratic nominee, and kind of get you to react to that. Here is that list up there as potential running mates: Josh Shapiro of Pennsylvania, the governor there, also Governor Andy Beshear of Kentucky, Roy Cooper, who's been campaigning with Kamala Harris, Senator Mark Kelly, interesting pick there, Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg, he was on cable, making the case against J.D. Vance, Governor Gavin Newsom, Gretchen Whitmer of Michigan. What should we ask her about that?
Well, you know what? Here's the question, Suzanne, I'd want to ask you, which is, when you see that list, first of all, you don't see that we put J.B. Pritzker on there. So the issue that I would think, and we'll see what you think, Suzanne, is this about what a vice presidential pick brings to the ticket? For example, you saw Josh Shapiro, who potentially brings Pennsylvania, with which J.D. Vance is rumored to reach out to because of the speech he gave at the RNC. He's reaching folks with a similar background, poor background, and all of that. So what kind of factors do you think Harris and her team will put, if assuming she's the nominee, will put into this selection of a vice presidential candidate?
The Veep stakes, right? This is always the question. We talk about the balancing of the ticket. Where might there be some electoral or perhaps experiential deficiencies of someone at the top of the ticket that it balances at the bottom of the ticket? Are there regional considerations? I mean, the evidence is very clear that whomever is chosen as vice president does not change the outcome of an election. It can make people more excited about voting for the person at the top. But because the person potentially at the top was already vice president and is a woman and is a Black and East Asian woman, the balancing of the ticket, if I'm being very honest, really is a white man at the bottom of the ticket, because there might be an electability issue. This is something that might be considered an electability issue of having a Black woman at the top of the ticket. The data suggests that that's the case and has been the case previously. So I think I'm looking at someone like Governor Beshear, someone like Governor Cooper, both from states that wouldn't necessarily elect a Democratic governor. They're both young and excited. Things that have been done, that Governor Beshear's done in Kentucky, I think are very important. I think people would be excited about Governor Whitmer. There's a lot of talk about having having two women on the ticket together. I think there's some wonderful things and great things about that.
But let me just say, is that too risky? Is having two women on the ticket too risky?
Well, and that's exactly the point, right? Is that there's this, and rightfully so, I think there's this this questioning of the Democratic Party whether a woman can beat Donald Trump, because the most qualified candidate the party had ever seen was beaten by Donald Trump, and now we have a woman with other minoritized identities. Do we need to balance with a white man at the bottom of the ticket? And I think that probably the answer is yes. I'm not necessarily happy about that answer, but I think the nature of our politics suggests that that's probably what needs to happen.
Two things to note: Gavin Newsom and Gretchen Whitmer have both said they will not be number two, so they've sort of taken themselves out of it. Now, they're going to remain on our list because you know, Suzanne, how politics works.
If you get the offer.
If you get the offer, if you're being vetted, if the Vice President of the United States calls you and says, I have an assignment for you, you're probably going to say yes to that. There's some polling indicating that Michigan is a real mess. Donald Trump having a big lead there. So, and same is true of Pennsylvania. Seems like bigger problems in Michigan. But we always say that the vice presidential pick is really your first presidential decision. This is a significant moment for Vice President Harris, isn't it?
It is. It absolutely is. And I think that the conversations will have already been happening about who that person might be. And there's people reaching out, I'm sure, already saying, please choose me. I think Newsom and Whitmer, because they have presidential aspirations, have no interest, at least now, in becoming a vice president in this way, and would really want to run on their own. But it is consequential because of what we know Vice President Harris will be up against as she's running at the top of the ticket. Who can sort of come in and be her proxy. We know vice presidential candidates typically are the attack dog, when the person at the top of the ticket has to be a little bit more tempered in their language and their attacks, that vice presidential candidates really go out and they're that attack dog. Now, Vice President Harris did not have that luxury as a Black woman to do that, but she might be able to pick somebody, or maybe will pick somebody, who can do that and really be her attack dog to go after Vance and after Trump during the campaign season.
Really brief follow-up. Pete Buttigieg is on these lists as well. And there's the white male that you talk about potentially. And he's very popular among Democrats, but he's also he's gay. So the question is that a risky pick when you're also trying to bring in independents and perhaps some unsatisfied Republicans, or is the country ready for that?
Yeah, this question of what are we ready for? Just the fact that we have to have a conversation about, can a woman win? Can a Black person win? Can an East Asian person win? Can a gay man win? The fact that we're even having the conversation suggests that we may trust ourselves and we may know who we like and who we want to vote for, but we don't trust other people. And because the stakes feel so high, that the safe bet typically is the bet we end up with. And to be honest, that's how candidate Biden won in 2020. He was the safe electable bet. We put a Black woman at the top of the ticket. We're already violating a safe electable bet. So who we put at the bottom of the ticket, it might just be a little too much, a little too fast.
Suzanne Schott, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. We know this was on such short notice, so thank you so much for helping us out this afternoon.
Thank you both. Get some rest.
All right, thanks, Suzanne. You're looking at a live picture from outside the Naval Observatory at this hour. We will bring that up. There it is. Well, that's the White House, actually. The Naval Observatory is where the vice president resides.
Maybe it's a transition picture.
Yeah, there you go. And there it is right there. That's exactly right. Anyway, we'll take a quick break, and we will be back with Congressman Raja Krishnamoorthi. Stay with us.